Okay, well, welcome Nancy Seasholes, who is the author of Gaining Ground, a book about land making in Boston. And that was such a successful book, and people were walking around trying to figure out where the land was made. She wrote an additional volume, a walking tours of Boston's made land. And she has just finished, as of last October, the Atlas of Boston History, which is a tremendous book, which is the book that we've been waiting 400 years to have. And I think only Nancy could have pulled this off. So we're really happy to have Nancy Seasholes with us, who will tell us about the Atlas of Boston History.
Now let's see if this works. Ha. Hello, everyone. Sorry I can't see you in person, but that's life with COVID. So, as Bob said, I'm going to tell you about this new book about Boston, the Atlas of Boston History. But before I tell you something about the Atlas, I want to say something about this bird's eye view that's on the cover. The University of Chicago Press, who published the Atlas, wanted to use a bird's eye on the cover. I think they felt it was a good marketing device. And I said, okay, although we don't use any bird's eyes as illustrations in the Atlas, but I said, all good color bird's eyes of Boston have already been used as book covers. So we were at something of an impasse when, fortunately, one of my former TAs, who is much better at searching the online catalog at the Leventhal Map Center at the BPL, found this bird's eye, which I'd never seen before. And I hope most other people haven't either. It was published in 1866 in Germany. It's titled Ansicht von Boston, View of Boston, nach der Natur aufgenommen, taken from nature. This bird's eye appeared in a German magazine called Die Gartenlaube, the Garden Pavilion, and had apparently been cut out of that magazine and then acquired in 2004 by the Leventhal Map Center, but had then sat uncatalogued for many years until finally recently their cataloger found it, cataloged it, and then used it in an exhibit that the Leventhal Map Center mounted in 2018 called Mapping Boston's Green Spaces. So it seemed to be the solution to our problem. And as you can see, the cover of the Atlas is a detail from this bird's eye. So now, what about the Atlas itself? The Atlas is an historical atlas of Boston, meaning it traces Boston's history through maps. In this case, through maps that were drafted especially for the Atlas by a team of cartographers. The Atlas has 35 different authors, of whom you can see Bob is one of them. The historians who determined the contents of the Atlas wanted it to tell the story of Boston's development from the end of the last ice age to the present. So the Atlas is organized chronologically into 11 sections. And I thought what I would do tonight is go through those sections and show you at least one example from each so you can get some idea of what's in the Atlas. My selection from these sections are things that have particularly to do with South Boston. So the very first section in the Atlas is about the Boston area before Boston was founded in 1630. And this is the very first, what we call plate in the Atlas. As you probably know, in an Atlas, the maps are arranged generally in double page spreads called plates. So this one shows that Boston, which is right in here, is in a geological formation called the Boston Basin, at the bottom of which are two different types of bedrock. In the northern part, shown with orange, is a sedimentary rock, a shale, called Cambridge argillite that looks like this. And that is what underlies South Boston, as you can see right here. In the southern part is a conglomerate. That's a rock that's composed of stones set in a matrix. It's called Roxbury conglomerate, or sometimes Roxbury pudding stone, because the early settlers thought that the small stones in the rock looked like the plums in plum pudding. There are two different types of Roxbury pudding stone, a light colored type with small stones and a darker colored type with large stones. The entire Boston Basin was completely covered with an ice sheet during the last ice age. It was very thick, and that's what we're showing here. This is a photograph of the Boston Basin taken from Belmont right up here. And on that, we've superimposed what the depth of the ice would have been. It was almost a mile thick, 4,000 feet, just to give you some sense of that ice sheet. That ice sheet extended all the way out to the islands, to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. When it melted, it left various layers of deposition, which is what we show here. Our next section is about Boston in the 1600s, and it includes this plate about, the founding of Boston in 1630 and the first 10 years of its development. This map shows the counties in England from which the first residents of Boston came. As you can see, most of them were in the eastern part of England, an area called East Anglia. This map is something of a coup. There's no other map like it. It shows the boundaries of the towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1640, superimposed on a modern map of towns so that you can see what towns were set off from the original towns. So here is South Boston, which, as you can see, was part of Dorchester. The Dorchester grant was huge. It extended all the way down to Rhode Island, and its southern boundary was today's boundary with Plymouth County. Dorchester included originally parts of Plainsville, Foxborough, Sharon, Stoughton, Avon, Canton, and Milton, as well as present-day Dorchester. Our next section is about Boston in the 1700s and includes this plate about Boston during the Revolution. These maps show the events of April 18th, 19th, 1775. The British march out to Concord, Paul Revere's and other rides out to warn the colonists, and then the British retreat back to Boston. This map also shows South Boston's moment of fame in the Revolution, and that was the installation of the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga on Dorchester Heights in March of 1776, where they were positioned so that they threatened the British ships that were anchored in the harbor and forced the British to evacuate from Boston, which they'd occupied during the war thus far. That's what we celebrate as Evacuation Day, which also conveniently coincides with St. Patrick's Day. Our next section is about the history of Boston from the end of the Revolution to 1828, and it includes this plate, which shows the early bridges that were built to connect that small peninsula to the mainland, and then the modern bridges that have supplanted them. We name them and date them. It also shows the beginning of what I call land making. That is the filling in of tidal flats to create new land, which, as Bob said, is what my major book is about. The different colors just represent different reasons for which the land was made. So looking down here at South Boston, let's see what it shows. South Boston was annexed to Boston in 1804 by a group of speculators who wanted to develop it as a new residential area. They were concerned about erosion on the north shore of South Boston, so they built a seawall on the line of what would have been West First Street and Foundry Street, and then filled in behind it, that making new land. Other new land had been made here for industries, that's yellow, and also for a commercial wharf. Here, we see that these early bridges in Boston connected to turnpikes on the mainland. This was the big period of turnpike building in the United States. So, as in an enlargement of this map, we see that the turnpike that came through South Boston was the Dorchester Turnpike, today's Dot Ave. Turnpikes in Massachusetts were required to run in as straight a line as possible, irregardless of hills, swamps, or any other natural impediment, which is why Dot Ave runs in such a straight line. Our next section we called the Athens of America because most of the plates concern Boston's cultural importance at the beginning of the 19th century, but it also includes this plate on railroad development. Two of the earliest railroads to enter Boston came through South Boston, and in an enlargement of this map, one was the Old Colony, which entered Boston in 1845 and ran on a route where Old Colony Avenue runs today. The other was what you can see was originally called the Boston and New York Central, later the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which crossed South Boston on a cut between A Street and B Street, which is where the bypass road runs today. Then this at the North Shore of South Boston, it ran on a pile bridge. Sorry, I need my pointer. Out over the flats before curving into its depot in Boston. And this curve is preserved today in the line of Melcher Street. Our next section we called Immigration and Industrialization. It's really about Boston in the middle of the 19th century. And I'm going to show you three plates from this section. The ones about the population and economy of Boston in 1855, and then the one on land making between 1828 and 1880. So here's the plate on the population of Boston in 1855. We have periodically throughout the atlas plates on Boston in a specific year. These plates generally have a graph showing the relation of Boston's population to other large cities in the US. So here is Boston in black, and you can see that in 1850, it was the fourth largest city in the US after New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Our plates on Boston in a specific year also generally have something about the composition of the population of Boston. These data were taken from the 1855 Massachusetts State Census of Population, which showed that in 1855, Boston was still predominantly populated by US-born whites, but that foreign-born were becoming increasingly important, particularly the Irish, shown, not surprisingly, in green. So the map on this side shows where these different groups lived in Boston. The data had been collected by ward, so that's what these graphs are. A separate graph for the population of each ward. The graphs are different sizes to show the comparative populations of the wards. So here is an enlargement of the section about South Boston. Now, first, I should point out that a new section had been annexed to South Boston in 1855. When South Boston was annexed to Boston in 1804, its southern boundary was this line, which ran between West 7th and West 8th Street. Then in the subsequent years, this settlement grew up on the neck and found that its ties were closer to South Boston than they were to Dorchester. It became known as Washington Village after 1850. It petitioned several times to be annexed to Boston, and its petition was finally accepted in May of 1855, but not in time to be included in that 1855 census of population. So these data I'm going to discuss are really based on the old boundaries of South Boston. So as you can see, in 1855, South Boston was still predominantly US-born whites, but Irish were a prominent minority group and would soon become a much more prominent. The map also shows where churches were located. One of the early Catholic churches was located on Broadway, where it still is. And these are Protestant churches of different denominations. In Boston, as you can see, Unitarian and Congregational churches were the most numerous, and they are in South Boston too. There are 2 of each. This area here, between basically the line of L Street and a line between N and O Streets, from the harbor down to East 4th Street, was land for the public institutions in Boston. These were things like what was called the House of Industry, the former almshouse or poorhouse. It was called the House of Industry at this point because the inmates were supposed to be working to defray the cost of the expense of keeping them. And they were to do that by farming, which is why this was such a large tract. Also, what was known as the House of Correction, which was basically a reformatory, and there was also a lunatic asylum. The 1855 map here illustrates an important feature of the atlas, and that is that we tried to make the shorelines of all the maps in the atlas accurate for the date of that plate. In other words, this isn't the modern shoreline of South Boston, it's the 1855 shoreline, as I think you can see here on this 1855 map of Boston, superimposed on a modern map is shown in the lighter green. The difference between the two is all the land that has been made between 1855 and the present. So we were always looking for historically accurate maps that our cartographers could use to recreate these historical shorelines. In this case, this shoreline is heavily based on this 1852 McIntyre map of Boston. Not only is the Boston Peninsula quite accurate, but it also shows Cambridge, Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, and Roxbury, which we knew we wanted to include for this plate on the economy of Boston in 1855. So here is an enlargement, again, of the South Boston part. And as you can see, relating these letters to the key, iron industries were important in South Boston in 1855, particularly Cyrus Alger's iron foundry here on the Fort Point Channel. Cyrus Alger's iron foundry made a number of different products, but it was noted for its cannon. And here's an 1855 illustration of casting cannon at the Alger foundry. Cyrus Alger's cannon were used by the Union troops during the Civil War. There are also, as you can see, some glass works on the harbor. And then down here, another iron foundry, which was the Bay State Iron Company. The Bay State Iron Company made a number of different products, as you can see, plate iron, ship plates, armor plates, and what they call railroad iron. The railroad iron were railroad tracks. And it was the tracks of the Bay State Iron Company that were the very first tracks laid in Sacramento, California, for the western part of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were shipped around Cape Horn on a clipper ship to San Francisco and then taken upriver to Sacramento. Next to the Bay State Iron Company was Briggs Shipyard, which had been founded in 1848 and in the 1850s was producing some notable clipper ships. This was the big era of clipper ship building in Boston. This was the time when Donald McKay had his shipyard in East Boston and was producing clippers such as the Flying Cloud. And then, as I said, I wanted to show you the plate about land making. So here again is the detail about South Boston. So land by 1880, land had been made, remember yellow stands for industries, along the Fort Point Channel and South Bay for some of these iron foundries. Here's Bay State Iron. This pink was institutional land, meaning this is land that the city had made in connection with the city institutions that had formerly been on this plot. They'd actually moved to Deer Island in 1847. Down here is the made land that Bob pointed out to me. This little piece here had been filled by Cyrus Alger's company to create a space where they could test cannon. So I think what they were doing was setting up cannon here and then firing them out into the harbor. But obviously the most prominent land making project is this huge wharf here, extending north of West First Street. This wharf had begun in the 1830s by the Boston Wharf Company, which had then added to it in degrees. And then this part up here, which is today's Van Pier, had been filled and created by the state, the Boston Harbor Commissioners. This was the beginning of a huge land making project called the Boston Flats Project. It had really had its inception in the 1860s when a federal commission had recommended building a seawall around the entire South Boston Flats. Basically, all of this, I'm now showing you what would be underneath the map, this whole area here, in order to direct what they called the scour, or the force of the ebb tide, into the Fort Point Channel and the main shipping channel in order to keep them open. This is what they thought at the time kept shipping channels open, was the force of the ebb tide. The federal commissioners soon agreed. They originally just recommended a seawall, but they soon agreed that the area behind it could be filled in. And that was really the, as I said, the beginning of the South Boston Flats project. So by 1880, it's basically this part had been filled, and we will see in a subsequent plate what happened next. Our next section we called Metropolitan Boston. It's really when Boston expanded from the original peninsula and some adjacent areas into the boundaries of the city as we know it today, which happened primarily between 1868 and 1873, when Boston annexed Roxbury, Dorchester, West Roxbury, Brighton, and Charlestown. The land area of Boston in 1868 is shown in orange. What was added to it during those 5 years is shown in red, tripling the size of Boston. And this map shows other annexations, including the Washington Village section of South Boston that I mentioned earlier. These new areas annexed to Boston could be accessed most easily by streetcars. This is before the automobile. So they became known as streetcar suburbs. And as you can see from these maps, they had a higher percentage of home ownership and a higher percentage of new houses than the older sections of the city. This didn't really affect South Boston as much because it was one of the older sections of the city. The maps on this side are based on data from the 1880 federal census and show the distribution of various occupational groups in Boston. So looking at South Boston, we can see there were not very many of the elite, the upper classes, but there were quite a number of what are called here the middling population, which means upper working class, lower middle class. Groups such as carpenters, clerks, grocers, and machinists, which means people who operated machinery. There were also obviously a lot of unskilled workers, people such as servants, laborers, and teamsters. Those are people who drove the horses that pulled the wagons and transported goods at this time. Now, these weren't the only occupational groups living in South Boston. These are just representative, but they, I would say, suggest that most of the population of South Boston at the time was this middling and unskilled workers. Our next section we call Boston in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We tried to avoid the term century in the atlas. You know, it's very confusing to people. You say 17th century, but you mean the 1600s. So as much as possible, we stuck to the term hundreds, but it did end us up in some awkwardnesses like this. I think this would have sounded a lot better if we'd been able to call it Boston in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Anyway, I'm going to show you 3 plates from this section, the one on sports and recreation facilities, one on Boston in 1910, and the 1910 mayoral election. So this is the one on sports and recreation venues during these years, and here is an enlargement of South Boston. Sailing clubs were very important in this era, and as you know, some of these still exist. The South Boston Yacht Club and Columbia Yacht Club still exist. On the L Street Beach, notice that it was divided into a women's beach and a men's beach. And South Boston also had one of Boston's baseball grounds. The Congress Street grounds did not operate for very long. It was used in 1890 and 91 by a group called the Boston Reds, and then again in 1894 by a National League team called the Boston Beaneaters after their baseball grounds in the South End had burned. Here is the plate on Boston in 1910. Here's the graph that shows Boston's population in comparison to other large cities. Boston again is in black. So by 1910, Boston was the 5th largest city in the US after New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and St. Louis. Actually, its population was almost the same as St. Louis. The two were only separated by about 10,000. This is a graph that shows something about the composition of the population of Boston in 1910, but I think it's a little deceptive. It's based on data from the 1910 federal census, which asked for information on nativity, that is, where people were born. Actually, Boston in 1910 was a predominantly Irish city. But as you can see from this, only 10% were actually born in Ireland. Most of them were people of Irish ancestry and would have been included in this group, US whites with a foreign-born parent. So looking at this graph, I don't think you really get the sense of how Irish Boston was in 1910. Maybe it shows up a little better on these maps. Irish were, of course, very predominant in South Boston, also in Charlestown, but South Boston also had a very large US-born white component. And also, looking at this, I was interested to see that there was a fairly large Jewish population in South Boston. The census did not ask for information about Jews, it asked for Russians. And so we use that as synonymous for Jews. Most of the Jews actually were located in the West End, where they had recently moved from the South End. And here's the one on the 1910 mayoral election. This was the election where John F. Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, the grandfather of JFK and Teddy Kennedy, beat James J. Storrow for the mayorship. This was the election that really changed control of Boston politics from the Yankees to the Irish. So it was a very close election. Honeyfitz won by something like only 4,000 votes. So here is how the various wards voted. As you can see, the most predominant of Honeyfitz's greatest margin was in South Boston, which of course was Irish, but he did very well in other wards with large immigrant populations. Storrow did best in Back Bay, Dorchester, Upper Roxbury, and then, or is it lower? I'm always making that mistake. And then in those new streetcar suburbs. And then this graph shows the preponderance of the vote by ward. Our next section is called decline. Boston had an unusually long depression. It began before the National Depression, which, as you know, didn't begin until 1929, and lasted much longer. Of the plates in this section, it seemed to me the one on public housing has the most information about South Boston. So here is an enlargement of the South Boston part of this map. Public housing in Boston began in the late 1930s when the Boston Housing Authority began to build family projects, the Mary Ellen McCormick, the Old Colony, and West Broadway. They stopped building family projects in 1954 and then moved to building projects for the elderly, which are shown with these smaller squares. And then in the 1970s began doing something different altogether, which was to issue vouchers for low-income families to use for housing. This is Section 8 housing. First in private projects, which are what these purple dots are, and then just later vouchers that people could use with any landlord they wanted. And the distribution of these are shown by zip code here. So I think the basic message is, as you can see, there's not much of this voucher housing in South Boston. And in fact, looking at the map, I'd say less public housing in South Boston than many other areas of the city. The next section is about the recovery after 1960 and includes this plate on land making between 1880 and 2003. So again, here is an enlargement of the South Boston part of the map. And now we can find out what happened to the South Boston Flats project. Remember, we had left it in 1880 with just this part already done. And remember, the point of it was to build this seawall around the South Boston Flats. It had started, as I told you, as a harbor improvement project to channel the force of the ebb tide into the shipping channel. But the harbor commissioners quickly turned it into a port development project and filled all this area with great enthusiasm to build new, big, modern piers served by railroads. They thought this was going to be a huge shipping terminal. So all of this in red here was done by the harbor commissioners. This project took a long time. It wasn't finished until the 1930s. This little bit right here was done by the Mass Port Authority in the 1980s. This was Subaru Pier. The gray was done by the Navy. As part of this South Boston Land Project, the huge dry dock that now exists at the eastern end of this was built between 1915 and 1919, and the Navy took it over in 1920, and then this area became an annex to the Navy Yard in Charlestown. During World War II, the Navy then added more piers, another dry dock, filled some land down here, and filled in the end of the reserve channel here to create land on which to build barracks for sailors. The reserve channel itself came into existence because the property owners on the North Shore of South Boston originally declined to participate in the South Boston Flats project. So the reserve channel was left open so that they could access their wharves. Other reasons for which land was made in South Boston were for parks, Marine Park, Moakley Park, and also in blue, new streets. The southern shore of South Boston was filled in the early years of the 20th century to create the land for what's now Day Boulevard. And then finally, we have a section on Boston, on present Boston, which has 3 plates on updating the infrastructure, 4 plates on the basis of the present economy, and then a final plate on Boston in 2010. So I'm going to show you one on the from the updating the infrastructure, one on the economy, and the final plate. The one on updating the infrastructure is about updating highways and public transportation. This is the section on the Big Dig, and one of the results of which was extending I-90 across the seaport part of South Boston to connect with the Ted Williams Tunnel, and to the extension of the building of the Silver Line, also across that same district, making this whole the northern part, the Seaport District of South Boston, much more accessible. Boston as a commercial center is Boston, well, at least before the pandemic, was an important place for office buildings, and some of which were built in South Boston. This was the land that was made by the South Boston Flats project. It basically sat unused for 100 years after the harbor commissioners had filled it with such enthusiasm. This is a photo taken in 1993. They had built one of these piers that they had built thinking it was going to be a big shipping pier, had become the World Trade Center. Here's Fish Pier. But most of this was just parking lots. And down here at this end, there were a few places that processed seafood. Finally, in the 1990s, as I said, after almost 100 years, this land began to be developed. I think because it was really the last big undeveloped part of Boston, and it was so close to downtown. So the federal courthouse was built, and then they began building hotels and office buildings, of which the Manulife building, I don't know if it's still called that, was built. It was right here. And this whole area, as you know today, is called the Seaport District, which I have to say, I think is a misnomer. It was never a seaport. That's what the harbor commissioners wanted. But frankly, I wish it was called the South Boston Waterfront, but I've given up objecting. The Seaport District, it seems to be. And then we have a final plate on Boston in 2010. Here's the graph showing Boston's population in relation to other large US cities. Here's Boston in black. By 2010, Boston was the 22nd largest city in the US. This is the map that shows the distribution of various groups in Boston. Each dot represents 50 people. Blue is whites, yellow is Hispanics, orange or, well, yeah, I'm sorry, what did I say? Yellow, orange is African Americans, green is Hispanics, and purple is Asians. So you can see that most of the population of South Boston in 2010 was white, but there were some Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians in this section here. So I hope that I have given you some sense of what's in the atlas, particularly as pertains to South Boston. And now I would be glad to answer any questions, but do we have any participants, Bob? Is there any way we can hear from people? No.
This has been really an astonishing overview of South Boston history, and I know it's really the tip of the iceberg for the atlas itself. And I really thank you for pulling out the South Boston pieces of it. And the atlas, I will tell everyone, is published by the University of Chicago Press. And for
it's
all
a great
that
big oversized book. I just want you to know.
It's a great big oversized book that is remarkably reasonably priced. It's only $40. And I understand people can get a discount on it. You sent me a discount code that the press gave, UCPNEW, and tremendous book. Everyone should have it. Great Christmas gift. And I think, is there anything, it seems like this atlas has everything in it. Now there must be something that you wished you could get in, but couldn't.
Oh yes, Many things. Well, all right. One thing just off the top of my head, I wish we'd been able to get in something more about the Harbor Islands. I feel they really got short shrift. As you know, because you were on the steering committee, we made a very conscious decision not to have a plate or plates on Boston in wars other than the Revolution, because we decided that what had happened to Boston in the Civil War, World War I, II, etc., was fairly similar to what had happened to other cities. In other words, it wasn't distinctive. Well, by doing that, I felt we missed the opportunity to be able to talk about what had gone on the Harbor Islands, a lot of which had to do with building fortifications, especially beginning with the Civil War. But if you've ever been, Bob, I know you have, but let's say for other people, if you've ever been to the Harbor Islands, you know that there's a series of forts and batteries and all sorts of things from the Civil War, World War I, and World War II.
Yes. Well, we have one in South Boston in Castle Island.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So, well, it was an island. It was a separate island at the time that that fort was built. So that's one thing. A second thing that I think we very consciously decided not to focus on were politics. That plate on the mayoral election of Boston in 1910 is our only plate specifically about politics. You know, there's a lot of interesting material about how Boston voted in many elections. But as you remember from those meetings, we wanted to explain why Boston, what drove Boston, why it changed and developed the way it did. And for that reason, we focused much more on economic developments. So there are a number of plates on the economy of Boston in various periods, of which I showed you one. So that's another thing that we missed. Third thing I regret particularly is there's no one plate that really talks about the neighborhoods as they are known. And I think that that is a big loss. But somehow it didn't work into what we were doing. And I think at the end we were busy and pressed, and we perhaps should have tried harder, but there is none.
Well, you did really show us how you can pull out from this and look specifically at South Boston. And I'm sure you could do the same with Charlestown, East Boston, Roxbury.
Yes, but in terms of looking at something like Upham's Corner or something like that,
right,
they're not identified that way.
Yeah, good. And let me see. So do other cities have similar, are there atlases for New York, Chicago, other cities?
No, they don't. There is one historical atlas of New York City that was done a long time ago. There is one of San Francisco that's a completely different beast. And so this is it. Actually, Chicago was hoping that this would be the first in a series of atlases about US cities. It hasn't come to pass yet, but that is what they would like to be publishing.
You really, present company accepted, you really did assemble the A-team of contemporary Boston historians, people who really study the city in depth. And I really wonder how you managed to get this array of scholars to commit themselves to working on this project.
I just asked them. I explained what the project was about, and almost everybody was willing to contribute. I must say, not everybody contributed promptly, as you said famously when we were at the Mass Historical Society. I became a terrible nag trying to get people to send in their materials, but and also. I think Sam Bass Warner was my wonderful advisor through most of this. And as he said, historians like to do things for free, which was very nice. At one point, I must say, my brother-in-law said, Nancy, they're never going to do anything for you if you don't pay them. But they did in the end.
Well, it's a great project. So, and really a wonderful thing that it will live on. And as I think I also said at the Mass Historical Society, the reason no one had done this before, it's because it's impossible to do a book like this. But I really give you tremendous credit for pulling this off and seeing it through. And I know many of us had doubts that it would ever come out, but here it is. And it's really a tremendous book. So congratulations and thank you for doing this, Nancy.
Thank you. Do you want to mention the award?
Yes, tell us, you were getting an award from Historic New England.
Yes, it's been awarded the Historic New England Book Prize, which is given actually for books that make a contribution to material culture. I still have to find out why they thought this did, but they also like books that show new scholarship about something in New England. So I'm very pleased about that.
Congratulations, very well deserved. And that's December with the award ceremony.
Yes.
So, well, congratulations and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was nice.
It was fun. Thank you, Nancy.
Bye.
Bye.
Now, how do I do
Okay,
this?
I've stopped recording.